Hello and welcome to Linux Terminology 101. In today's video I'm going to be talking about all the terms that relate to the word Linux. And we'll start off with the word Linux itself, because quite often you'll use the word Linux thinking that it's the operating system, and somebody will say to you, no, Linux is just the kernel, the operating system is GNU Linux. So what is Linux itself? Linux was written in the early 90s by a man called Linus Torvalds, and it's responsible for interacting with your hardware devices and stuff like that. It's the engine, it's the kernel, it's the thing that makes things work. But the actual operating system is actually called GNU Linux. So GNU Linux is the Linux kernel with a load of applications and software written on top of it to make it into an actual operating system. Well, so if GNU Linux is the operating system, what the hell are things like Ubuntu and Fedora and Debian? Well, they are called Linux distributions, but equally you can call Ubuntu a Linux-based operating system or Fedora a Linux-based operating system. Even though the operating system itself is GNU Linux, people interchangeably use the terms Ubuntu and Fedora and Debian and Arch as Linux-based operating system, but they're more commonly known as Linux distributions. So we've got a Linux distribution. What exactly is a Linux distribution? A Linux distribution is the methodology used to provide the operating system to you as a user. So if we think about things like Debian, what you have is what's known as a fixed release distribution. And so what happens is they write all the software and they update all the packages and they release it to you once every so often. And Ubuntu works in the same way. It releases once every 6 months, and basically they add in all the new changes they want to make, and then once every 6 months they release a new version of the operating system. And typically with Ubuntu they do something called a long-term support release, or LTS, and that's released every couple of years, and that usually has a long support period. And so what happens with the interim ones is the ones every 6 months, they're generally speaking there for trying new things out. They have a short support life, but they try out new things. Now packages still update, so you still get things like the latest version of LibreOffice and stuff like that, but it only goes up in point releases. It doesn't come up into the next major version, etc. Whereas if you use something like Arch Linux is what's called a rolling release distribution. So you'll hear the terms fixed release and rolling release. So a rolling release distribution updates itself as it goes along. So you only have to install it once and it will continually update and update and update, in the same way as Windows 11 is currently doing, although they are looking possibly to go back to more of a fixed release schedule. So you've got a rolling release distribution like Arch, and you've got a fixed release distribution like Debian, and that's not the only differences. So you have Arch. Arch is not only rolling release, it is also cutting edge. It stays up to date with the most latest versions of the applications. So I change a package somewhere and I go from version 4 to version 5, and Arch says, I'm having that, thank you very much, I'll give that to all my users. Whereas Debian says, well, if you go up from version 3 to 3.1, 3.2, yeah, we'll give it to our users if it's just bug fixes and stuff like that. But version 4, we'll test that thoroughly and we'll put that out in one of our fixed releases. So that's what you're getting with Debian. So Debian's more stable because it's less likely to break, because it's very selective about which applications and which libraries and which packages get into their ecosystem. Whereas Arch is more likely to say, oh, so there's something new, I'm going to have that, thank you. So Arch has all the latest stuff, but maybe a little bit more flaky, whereas Debian has older stuff, but is more stable. Now all the other Linux distributions fit somewhere in between that tree. So you'll have things like Fedora. Fedora is quite up to date, and then you'll have things like Ubuntu, which is more up to date than Debian, but probably not as up to date as Arch. And then you have Linux Mint, the same as Ubuntu, and OpenSUSE. Now OpenSUSE is an interesting one because they have both a fixed release version and a rolling release version. So you can have the best of both worlds. Now the actual release mechanism isn't the only thing that differentiates a Linux distribution. There's the different installers. So, for instance, there's something called the Calamares installer, and that's used by quite a lot of distributions. And basically, it's a really easy tool to use, graphically install the distribution, and you basically select things like your language, your keyboard layout, you connect to the internet, you choose which desktop environment it may be, you choose which disk it's going on, say where you are in the world and set up a user, boom, gone, it installs Linux is there on your machine, and that's the Calamares installer. But some distributions don't use that. Things like Debian, they've got more of a text-based installer, or there is a graphical installer, but it's not graphical as in runs as part of the live installer. Although you can run Debian with a live installer, and then you've got Arch, which is a text-based installer, but then you've got Arch-based distributions like Endeavour that have a graphical installer, and then you've got Fedora, which has the godforsaken Anaconda installer which should never see the light of day. So that the installers are something that are different on each distribution. And another thing that's different on each distribution is the desktop environment. Now, a lot of the distributions give you the opportunity to install with multiple desktop environments. For instance, Debian, OpenSUSE and Fedora, you can choose which environment you want, but they usually default. So for instance, Fedora will default to the GNOME desktop. I think Debian does as well. It depends if you use the net installer or not. Ubuntu really only comes with one desktop environment, but there are different flavors of Ubuntu even. So when we talk about flavors, we basically say, well, we've got Ubuntu, and that's Ubuntu with the GNOME desktop, and then you've got Kubuntu, which is Ubuntu with the KDE desktop environment, and then you've got Xubuntu, which is Ubuntu with the XFCE, Lubuntu, and you've got Ubuntu Mate. So you've got different flavours of Ubuntu even, whereas some of them it's just you install one desktop environment and then you can just install another one if you want to. So a desktop environment, what is it? So you've got different types of desktop environment. You've got KDE, and you've got GNOME, and you've got XFCE, and LXQT, Budgie, Pantheon, all different desktop environments. But what are they? So a desktop environment is a set of tools that help you manage your system, and generally speaking, it's the way things look and feel within your operating system. So typically the things that make up a desktop environment is a window manager, and that's, as it sounds, this is the thing that manages the windows on your machine. So you can have different types of window manager. You can have cascading, you can have tiling, etc. You can have different panels. So a panel, if you think of Windows, the little taskbar at the bottom of your screen, and that's called a panel in Linux. And you can have multiple panels on a screen, and panel can be a panel or it can be a dock. So if you think about Windows, a panel would be the thing that you use for Windows 10 because it goes all the way across the bottom of the screen. But in Windows 11 it's more of a docking bar because it's just a dock with different icons on it. So technically speaking, they're both really just panels, but one's longer than the other. That's the way I see it. Now, a panel generally has a system tray in it as well, and a system tray is the same as Windows. It's a little tray of icons in the bottom right corner, and it enables you to change things like your volume settings, your internet settings. You can log out, it's got the clock in it and things like that. And then you've got quick launch icons on the left and a menu button. But not all desktop environments have these panels in that way. And the desktop environment can look and feel different. So if you look at Cinnamon and KDE, they're more traditional based with, like I say, panels and menus. So Cinnamon typically looks a lot like Windows 7, and KDE can look like that as well. But they're both quite customizable. Whereas the GNOME desktop is more futuristic. It's you press the applications button and it'll blow up on the screen with lots of different big large icons on it and a search bar, and you can choose the workspaces that you want to use. Now there's another term that we should use is workspaces. So workspace is, it's not actually Windows now has workspaces as well. Essentially you can have one set of applications open in one workspace, and you can have another workspace with different applications open, and it's basically virtual screens on your desktop. So carrying on with the desktop environment theme, so you have something called a display manager, and display managers are usually responsible for session management and logging users in and handling your actual sessions. Now desktop environments differ in other ways, so GNOME and KDE are quite resource intensive when you compare it to LXQT or XFCE. XFCE is incredibly customizable. You can customize all the options on the screen, but it's quite lightweight in terms of memory usage, and LXQT is even more lightweight, so it's perfect for older machines. Now if we continue talking about the desktop environment, when you think of GNOME and KDE, the desktop environment basically also includes all the tooling. So a file manager in Windows is like your Windows Explorer. So in Linux you have different file managers, and most desktop environments have a file manager that come with them, and they differ between each desktop environment. So desktop environment might also include a terminal. So a terminal is where you can enter commands, and it's the thing that a lot of Windows users get scared about Linux, because they think they're going to spend their entire life inside a terminal, when that can't be further from the truth. And desktop environments also include other tools such as notepad apps, image viewers, calendar apps, calculators, and things like that. So that's your desktop environment. Is a mixture of window managers, panels, widgets, icons, menus, display managers, and stuff like that. So the next thing we'll talk about is packages and package management. So typically in the past, distributions like Debian, they use something called the deb format package. Now the deb format package and the way you would install these deb packages, you would open up the terminal window and you'd use a package manager, and a package manager for installing deb packages is called apt. So you'd have to type sudo apt install and the name of the package, and you could search for packages by doing sudo apt search and the name of the package. Now each distribution has a different type of package manager. Fedora uses RPMs, and it used to use Yum, and now it uses DNF. And then you've got OpenSUSE, used to use Zypper, and then you've got Arch uses Pacman. And they all use different package formats, and they all use different package managers from the terminal. Now if you use GNOME or you use KDE, then quite often they've got their own graphical package installer. So for KDE, you've got a tool called KDE Discover, so you don't actually have to know the command line tools to be able to install packages. And GNOME the same, you can use the GNOME software manager. And there are some lightweight package managers that are graphical as well. A couple that I can think of off the top of my head is Octopi and Synaptic. And then you've got distributions like MX Linux have their own graphical package managers for installing packages. Now the deb format and the RPM formats that are used for package management, these work on the basis that if I have two applications, say one's a music program and one's a video program, they both need to play music, for instance. They both need to play sound, so they might share the same sound library. So you can imagine your music package is needs version 1.0 of that library, and the video program needs version 2.1. Now this causes a problem because 2.1 suddenly decides it's not going to include all the features of 1.0 because they want to make the package smaller, and suddenly your audio player doesn't work anymore. So that caused issues in the past where you had libraries that weren't compatible with the applications that were installed. So they came out with new package management formats and containerized packages. So if you've seen Ubuntu, you might know that it's used something called a snap package. Now a snap package is a containerized package, and what it does, it takes the application that you actually want to run, for instance your music program, and it includes all its dependencies in that container. So any library that's required for playing the music, for searching for album covers, anything that's in there that you might need is in that container. So in the past, the Debian package formats were great because disk space used to be more expensive, so you'd share these libraries so it would take up less disk space, leaving you more room for your images and your videos. But now the disk space is cheaper, it's better to have all the files in a container, or that's how it's deemed to be at this moment in time. You've got it in the container, and that way it's guaranteed to run, and you can have two packages needing two different versions of a library, and it's okay because each one's got their own versions in their own containerized format. Now you might see people say that Snap's rubbish, it's slow, it's cumbersome, it doesn't work very well. That might have been true a couple of years ago, but I would say that it's working quite well now. It might not be quite as slick as a Debian package. They're certainly larger in size, but then they've got all the dependencies inside them, but they work quite well. So another containerized package format is a Flatpak, and that comes with distributions like Linux Mint and Fedora, Debian. So Flatpaks work pretty much the same way as Snaps. You have to read the documentation to see what the differences are. I believe Flatpaks, whilst everything's in a container, they use this thing called modules. So the modules themselves might have shared resources, but the actual containers themselves have the individual libraries that they need and everything that they need inside them. And the great thing about containerized packages is that they can't interfere with other packages on the system. So I can install the Google Chrome Flatpak, for instance, and it can't interfere with any other application on my system because it can only work inside of that container. Now earlier on you might have heard me use the term sudo. Now sudo is a command that you'll become instantly familiar with if you learn Linux in any way whatsoever. Essentially sudo enables you to run any command as another user. Now typically when you run sudo, the default is the root or admin user for the machine. So you run sudo and any command, as long as you've got the password and the rights to run sudo, it will run that command as if you're an admin. But you can use sudo to run commands as other users. So other terms you might hear, well, you might hear grub. Now grub is the unified bootloader. I can't remember what the GR stands for. I think it's grand maybe. Anyway, essentially you can, when you boot your computer, it will show a little menu at the start and you can pick which operating system you're going to boot into, and you can do something called dual booting. So if you want to run Windows and Linux, you can split up the partitions of your hard drive, or you can use multiple drives if you want, and you can have each operating system on either different partitions or different drives, and then the grub menu will show each each distribution or each operating system in the menu, and you can pick which operating system you want. Now dual booting, the word dual usually means two, which makes it suggest that you can only run two operating systems at a time via grub. That's not the case. You can run as many as your machine can handle and how much disk space you have. So you could dual boot 4 or 5 different distributions. So if it's 4, I guess it's quad booting. Another thing to be aware of is the bootloader. So the bootloader, it could be master boot, or it can be EFI. Now if your machine's quite old, it might be the master boot record that it uses, but typically in the last at least 10 years it's been EFI, and what that means is you have an EFI partition at the big front of your disk, and it's usually about 1 gigabyte in size, can be less than that, and it basically includes all the things that you can boot on your machine in that partition. Whereas the master boot record, you just put the boot record on the drive that you want to boot from, and it boots, and it doesn't take up any space at all really, the master boot record. Now, for actually putting Linux on your machine, you might have heard of an ISO image. So an ISO image is basically a disk image that's compressed into a single file. So everything you need in a single file. So typically, if you want to install a Linux distribution, you have to download the ISO image from a website, and once you've downloaded that, you then need a tool such as Etcher or Ventoy to put that ISO image onto the USB, and then you can boot from it. And finally, one of the other things that you might need to be aware of, is probably not that important to most people, is there's different file systems available for Linux. So generally speaking, most distributions I think go for the ext4 format. So there's presumably an ext, an ext1, 2, 3, and so 4's been around quite a long time, probably at least 15 years, I thought. And generally speaking, when you install a distribution, it will pick the ext4 file system to install your operating system, and it's fine. Most people use that and you don't even know about it. It's just the way it is. But it's worth noting that there are different types of file system out there, like journaling file systems, the ZFS, BTRFS, etc. And that's really the end of the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you can think of any other terms that you think you want me to explain, please put them in the comments, and hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you next time on Everyday Linux User.